Distinguished panel of experts to today's hearing focused on how we maintain readiness in an age of austerity, or more particularly, what is the risk to the national defense of our country if we continue making some of the cuts to defense we hear being discussed in Washington. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us this morning, and I know several of you had to cancel long-standing personal commitments to be with us this morning. I appreciate your willingness to testify before this subcommittee once again on this most important topic. In the interest of time, because we know that we could have votes coming any time, and we may have to recess and do those votes and then come back because this is important and we want to get all of this on the record, I'm going to dispense with any normal opening remarks. Since Ms. Berdallo is not here, we will dispense with her remarks and have both of them put in the record. I would like to, however, look at a procedural matter that we use in this committee, and that is we discussed prior to the hearing that we'd like to dispense with the 5-minute rule for this hearing and depart from regular order so that members may ask questions during the course of the discussion. I think this will provide a roundtable type forum and will enhance the dialogue on these very important issues. We would like to proceed with standard order for members to address the witnesses. However, if any member has a question pertinent to the matter being discussed at the time, please seek acknowledgment and wait to be recognized by the Chair. We plan to keep questioning to the standard 5 minutes. However, I don't want to curtail productive dialogue. I ask unanimous consent that for the purposes of this hearing, we dispense with the 5-minute rule and proceed as described. Without objection, it is so ordered. Gentlemen, we are delighted to have you here with us today. We have the honor of having General Corelli with us, who's the Vice Chief of the United States Army. He's been such since August 4, 2008. He has commanded at every level, from platoon to corps. He's commanded the United States European Command, the Director of Operations and Readiness and Mobilization at Headquarters, the Department of the Army. We also have Admiral Ferguson, and Admiral, we're delighted to have you with us. He's the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Navy Personnel Command, and he's the Chief of Legislative Affairs and Chief of Naval Personnel. Also, General Joseph F. Dunford, Jr. He's the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps. General Dunford has gone through the U.S. Army Ranger School, Marine Corps Amphibious Warfare School, and U.S. Army War College, has a very distinguished career, and we appreciate the expertise that he brings to this panel. And last but certainly not least is General Breedlove. And General, we appreciate you once again being with us. General Breedlove is the Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. He's a Georgia Tech graduate, and General, we enjoyed, as a graduate of the University of Virginia, playing you the other week, and it may be the one bright spot we'll have this year, but thanks for your help and cooperation in that. He's also a graduate of Arizona State University, where he had his Master of Science degree, and the National War College. And without further ado, we want to get right to your opening statements. We're pleased to have the ranking member has joined us now. We also have with us the chairman of the full committee. Madeline, we talked about before you got here, we're dispensing with our opening statements and putting them in the record because they're going to call votes at about 10:15.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to welcome our witnesses today and also to place my statement in the record.
And we just appreciate your service to this committee, and Madeline and I work as very close partners, and we have a special relationship, and I just appreciate her help with this committee and the great work that she does. With that, we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to put your statements in the record, and they've already been made in the record. And as I told all of you before, we want you just to tell us the importance of what we have. And I'm going to tee each of you up with a question, but then I want you to expound on it with your testimony, anything that you want to say. And we'll start, General Corelli, with you. And as you know, we have heard we've already had about $465 billion to cuts to national defense that have taken place in the country. Some people talk about an additional $600 billion coming. There are discussions that that's going to significantly reduce the force that we have in the United States Army. General, you have been serving for a long time. You have served in almost every capacity in the Army. When we talk about risk and the risk that these cuts could have, sometimes we talk about them in terms of institutions and missions, but it really comes down to men. You have seen that historically. What have these kind of cuts done to the risk to your men that will serve under you? If you'd please address that question, and then any other comments you'd like for your opening statement, and we now turn it over to you.
Well, Chairman Forbes, Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Bordallo, distinguished members, I thank you for allowing me to be here today. These are, for sure, challenging times. You've heard me say that before. We are past a decade of war with an all-volunteer force. We've always had volunteers in our force, but I think it's important to note that we've never done this before. We've never fought for 10 years. We've never fought with an entirely volunteer force. That force is amazingly resilient, but at the same time, it is strained. Its equipment is strained, soldiers are strained, families are strained. But they've been absolutely amazing over these 10 years of war. I'd like to leave you with 3 key points in my opening statement. First is that we recognize budget cuts and corresponding reductions to force structure will be made. However, we must make them responsibly, so that we do not end up with either a hollowed-out force, and I can expand on that later on, or an unbalanced force. Our nation is in the midst of a fiscal crisis, and we recognize we must all do our part. We are continuing to identify efficiencies. We worked very, very hard on our capability portfolio review process, which have found many of those efficiencies, and we will book many, many more. When we appeared before the committee in July, we were looking at cuts in the vicinity of $450 billion over 10 years. If the Army's portion of that cut is at historical percentages, at about 26%, that will be, in fact, tough, but as the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army have said, it will be doable. I'm the vice, I get paid to worry about things, and I worry our cut may be a little higher than that, and that causes me some angst. But above and beyond that will directly and deeply impact every part of our Army and our ability to meet our national security objectives and effectively protect our country against all threats. Whatever cuts are made carry risks. And historically, it's amazing to sit here as the Vice Chief of Staff, where so many of the 32 before me or 31 before me have sat at a similar time in our history and had to make some of the same arguments and answer some of the same questions. I'm sure that was true in the debate after the war. I was in Indianapolis recently, and I saw a war memorial to the war. Of course, it was World War I, and we cut our Army down to just over 300,000 folks, only to grow it to 8.5 million to fight that 4-year war. At the end of that war, we cut our Army again, down to about 530,000 folks, soldiers. This number sounds familiar, I hope. And we ended up with the Korean War. And in the Korean War, the first battle of that war was for the Army, very famous Task Force Smith, an ill-equipped, ill-trained force that had infantry battalions that were incomplete, infantry battalions that were missing, and the results were predictable. And it's interesting to note that General Bradley, when the cuts were talked about after World War II, supported them. He went on to say that the strength of the military depended upon the economy, and we must not destroy that economy. But in his autobiography, after the Korean War, Bradley wrote, "My support of this decision, my belief that significantly higher defense spending would probably wreck the economy, was a mistake. Perhaps the greatest mistake I made in my post-war years in Washington." I lived through an Army that came out of Vietnam and did some of the same kind of things, and for 10 to 12 years we had to rebuild that Army. These questions, these decisions have been made before, and there's just a tendency to believe at the end of a war that we'll never need ground forces again. Well, I tell you that we've never got that right. We have always required them. We just don't have the imagination to always be able to predict exactly when that will be. My final point is that whatever decisions are made, whatever cuts and reductions are directed, we must ensure we do not lose the trust of the soldiers, the brave men and women who have fought for these last 10 years, and their families. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General, and we hope to get into that in a little more depth as this hearing goes on and what that compensation cuts could mean to your force, but thank you for that. Admiral Ferguson, you are facing a tough time now as we tee up your opening remarks. You're looking at a Navy, as we understand the facts, that we can argue about numbers, but China right today has more ships in their Navy than we have in our Navy, according to Admiral Willard. And again, we can pick or choose some of them, not through any fault of yours, but through dollars and cents we've sent to you. You've got a $367 million shortfall in your maintenance budget because of dollars we haven't given to you. We recognize that on surface-to-surface missiles, we have a distinct challenge between Chinese missiles and our missiles because we haven't given you dollars we needed for technology. In addition to that, we see the projection for our subs that could put us in the next 10 years where China would have 78 subs to roughly 32 for ours. And we can argue a little bit around the edges of those, but what do these cuts mean to you, this $465 billion that we've already done, to your men and women serving under you and to the United States Navy? And what would it mean if we put additional cuts out to you? Anything you want to put in your opening remarks, we want to hear from you now.
Well, thank you, Chairman Forbes, Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Wardallo, and distinguished members of the Readiness Subcommittee. It's my first opportunity to testify before the committee. It's my honor to represent the men and women of the Navy, active reserve, and civilian who do stand watch around the globe today. And I'd like to offer my appreciation on their behalf for the congressional support of them and their families. In an era of declining budgets, we are ever mindful of the lessons of the past when we assess force readiness. Taken in sum or in parts, low personnel quality, aging equipment, degradation in material readiness, and reduced training will inevitably lead to declining readiness of the force. We remain committed to maintaining our Navy as the world's preeminent maritime force. And to do so, we must sustain a proper balance among the elements of current readiness and to the long-term and those long-term threats to our national security. Those elements of readiness may be simply stated: sustain the force structure that possesses the required capabilities to face the threat, man that force with high-quality personnel with the requisite skills and experience, support it with adequate inventories of spare parts and weapons, sustain the industrial base that sustains that force, and exercise it to be operationally proficient and relevant. So our objective and challenge in this period of austerity will be to keep the funding for current and future readiness in balance and holding acceptable level of risk in the capacity of those forces to meet the requirements of the combatant commanders. How we shape ourselves in this environment must be driven by strategy, and we feel that's extraordinarily important. The cuts that are contained that you discussed, Chairman Forbes, we will accept as part of that some reductions in capacity. It will affect certain areas of presence that we have around the world, our response times, but the decisions will be tough, but they're executable. And we think that in looking at the strategy review that's going on in the Department, we can meet those challenges, and we will meet those challenges that's contained in the Act. We intend to take a measured approach, and we'll look at both efficiencies in our overhead, our infrastructure, personnel costs, our force structure, and our modernization. Absent the support of the Congress, and you alluded to the impact of sequestration, that impact on our industrial base and our Navy would be immediate, severe, and long-lasting, and fundamentally change the Navy that we have today. So, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Wardallo, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify and look forward to answering your questions as we go forward.
Thank you, Admiral Ferguson. And General Dunford, you have also served your entire career with the men and women under you in the Marines, and one of the things that a lot of people believe is that once we get out of Iraq and we get out of Afghanistan, you'll have all the resources you need to do everything you need to do around the world. If you look at the cuts that have already been made, and we look at these potential cuts from sequestration, the projections are that your forces could go down as low as 150,000 men and women. If that were to occur, what would that impact be on you? And would you be able, even if we were out of Iraq and Afghanistan, to conduct a single contingency around the world. And with that, if you'd answer that question and any opening remarks that you have, General, the floor is yours.
Chairman McKeon, Chairman Forbes, Ranking Member Bordallo, members of the committee, thanks very much for the opportunity to appear before you today to talk about the readiness in the Marine Corps, and more importantly, to have the opportunity to thank you for your support of your Marines. As we meet this morning, almost 30,000 are around the world doing what must be done, 20,000 of those in Afghanistan, and I want to assure you this morning that those Marines remain our #1 priority, and with your support, they are well trained and ready to do the mission. Like you and my colleagues, I recognize that the nation faces an uncertain security environment and some difficult fiscal challenges, and there's no doubt we have some tough decisions to make. To support the difficult decisions we have to make, we've recently this year gone through a force structure review effort. We've shared the results of that with the committee in the past, and would offer that that framework will allow us to provide recommendations to the Secretary of Defense and, frankly, to frame the issues similar to the ones that the Chairman asked me as his opening question. I want to assure you that we recognize the need to be good stewards of resources, and we're working hard to account for every dollar. We're also looking to make sure that every dollar is well spent. In the end, we know we're going to have to make cuts. As we provide our input, I think we need to address 3 critical considerations: strategy, balance, and keeping faith. With regard to strategy, we simply need to know what the nation requires us to do, and then with the resources available, we'll build the most capable force we can to do it. As Secretary Panetta refines the strategy, the Commandant is going to use what we learned during the force structure review effort to make recommendations. With regard to balance, we don't want to make cuts in a manner that would create a hollow force. We've certainly seen that in past drawdowns. Like General Corelli mentioned, I've seen that personally in the 1970s as a young lieutenant, and we don't want to go back to the days where we have an imbalance between our training, between our equipment, and between our modernization efforts. What the Commandant is committed to is that regardless of the size of the Marine Corps at the end of the day, every unit that's in the United States Marine Corps will be ready to respond to today's crisis today. Finally, we have to keep faith with our people. And we need to do that because it's the right thing to do and because it's necessary for us to maintain a high-quality, all-volunteer force. In all of our deliberations, we need to send a loud and unmistakable message that the contributions that our men and women have made over the past 10 years are recognized and appreciated. And there's certainly many different definitions of keeping faith, and I think something attributed to George Washington gives us a good baseline for our discussion this morning. Washington said, "The willingness of future generations to serve shall be directly proportional to how they perceive veterans of early wars were treated and appreciated by our nation." And those words to me seem as relevant today as they were over 200 years ago. Chairman Forbes, to get back to your specific question, what would happen if the Marine Corps was at 150,000? When we went through the force structure review effort, we came up with a size Marine Corps of 186,800. That is a single major contingency operation force. So that force can respond to only one major contingency. 150,000 would put us below the level that's necessary to support a single contingency. The other thing I would think about is what amphibious forces have done over the past year: humanitarian assistance, disaster relief efforts in Pakistan, supporting operations in Afghanistan with fixed-wing aviation, responding to the crisis with pirates on the MV Magellan Star, supporting operations in Libya, supporting our friends in the Philippines and Japan, and quite frankly, at 150,000 Marines, we're going to have to make some decisions. We will not be able to do those kinds of things on a day-to-day basis. We will not be able to meet the combatant commanders' requirements for forward deployed, forward engaged forces. We will not be there to deter our potential adversaries. We won't be there to assure our potential friends or to assure our allies. And we certainly won't be there to contain small crises before they become major conflagrations. So I think at 150,000 Marines, I would offer there would be some significant risk, both institutionally inside the Marine Corps, because we will be spinning faster and causing our Marines to do more with less. But as importantly, perhaps more importantly, the responsiveness that we'll have to combatant commanders' contingencies and crisis response will be significantly degraded.
Thank you, General. And General Breedlove, we thank you for working in your schedule to be here. Oftentimes we hear everybody talking about leaving Iraq and Afghanistan, but we know when the Air Force, when everybody else might come home, the Air Force oftentimes does not come home. They still have to stay there and continue to do operations. I'd like to have any comments that you have about what these cuts have made to the Air Force already and what future cuts could do, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Forbes, Chairman McKeon, Congresswoman Bordallo. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about 690,000-plus proud airmen who serve as a part of a joint team that you see in front of us. These are challenging times, and the Air Force has been at war for more than 2 decades. We have fought alongside our joint team in Afghanistan since 9/11, and we went to the Gulf and at the Gulf War in the beginning of the 90s, and we didn't come home, to your point, sir. Quite often when the nation comes back from a war, we leave significant assets to overwatch remaining forces to provide support to those who would remain behind in the regions, and that was witnessed, as you know, in Northern Fly Watch and Southern Watch, and the Air Force stayed there and kept pretty high op tempo. The cuts that we see in front, I think my remarks we'll talk about in just a minute. They are challenging times, and the ops tempo is exacerbated, I think, by the fact that our Air Force, since the opening of the Gulf War, has 34% fewer aircraft than we started that war with, and about 26% fewer people. So the tempo that we face, which we don't see a change in the future, puts a pretty big stress on the force, and that has led to a slow but steady decline in our unit readiness, as we have discussed with this committee before. We have tried to reset in the middle of that to pick up new missions. As you know, the Air Force has built mission inside, as we have been asked to support this joint team in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. We've also been asked to build an increased capacity in special operations, and we will continue to meet both of those requirements as a part of this joint team and answer the call in the future. All the while, the strain put on our force in the need to recapitalize our aging fighter, tanker, and bomber fleets. As you know, we're flying the oldest fleet that the Air Force has ever flown, and we do need to desperately get to recapitalization during this age of fiscal austerity. The Department of Defense, we know, will have to be a part of this recovery, and the Air Force will play its part in that recovery. Our goal is to do 2 things, and you've heard several of my predecessors remark on them. First of all, maintain a credible military force. We expect that it will be smaller and, quite frankly, much smaller in some areas. But we need to remain a credible and capable force as we get smaller. And second, to avoid becoming a hollow force. Like Joe and Pete mentioned, I was in the Air Force in the 70s and saw what a hollow Air Force looked like. A flight line with airplanes that couldn't fly, and buildings with many people who had no training or ability to go out and accomplish a mission if the airplanes had flown. And we don't want to go there again. We will get smaller to remain capable with the forces that are left behind. Many of the challenges we see will come on our people and on the backs of our people. As we get smaller and as we expect, the tasking does not change. As we mentioned, in many cases we stay behind when there's a peace dividend. The deploy to dwell times and the op tempo on our airmen will only increase, and more importantly, I think the op tempo on our proud reserve component, which you know is an integral part of our Air Force, will have to increase because they will become ever more important in a diminishing force. Finally, sir, if the sequester cuts envisioned in the Budget Control Act are allowed to take place, we're going to have to go beyond just getting to our capacity. We believe we'll have to then begin to look at what are the capabilities that we'll have to shed and no longer offer to this joint team. A reduction in size would reduce the number of bases that we could support, the number of airmen that we could keep on board the Air Force. The impact to the size of our industrial base will certainly be important, just as it is to the Navy. And then finally, much as Joe has mentioned, as we downsize, some of the first missions we'll have to shed is that engagement that we see around the world, where we preclude further conflict or where we build allies that will help us to come fight. We'll not be able to make those contributions. I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, General. And as each of you know, this is probably the most bipartisan committee in Congress. We work together very, very well, and it's a privilege to have all of our members here. We're also honored today we have the chairman of the full committee, and part of the reason that we serve in such a bipartisan and effective means is because of his leadership. He's graciously said that he'd like for our members to be able to ask questions, so I don't think he's going to ask any questions, but I'd like to defer to him now for any comments that he might want to make. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here and for your comments. I think that the cuts that you're all working hard to put into place, I met with Admiral Mullen probably a month and a half ago, and he said that he had assigned to the chiefs $465 billion in cuts, and that came from the President's speech of cutting $400 billion and the $78 billion that they had found and the $100 billion that you had gone through in efficiencies, and what we did in the CR. It's accumulation of a lot of things, and it's hard to actually get the exact number. I know when the Secretary came up a couple of weeks ago, he was using 450 plus. I've also heard 489. So it's somewhere between 450 and 500 billion that you're dealing with that we'll start hearing the details on, I'm sure, in January. But I think many in Congress, and I think most people in the country, do not understand. They're focused on the super committee and the 500 to 600 billion that will be hit with if they're not able to do their work. But they don't realize the extent of the cuts that you've been working on now for a period of time and that will be hitting us next year. And we're talking, well, we've had 5 hearings at the full committee level, not counting all of the committees meetings, subcommittee level, to try to get a handle on this and to try to educate the rest of the Congress and the rest of the populace of the country as to what really is going to happen to our military. The first 5 hearings were the impact of on the actual military, the men and women that you serve with, those who are laying their life on the line right now as we talk. I've seen in my lifetime lots of drawdowns. I've never seen us do it when we're fighting a war. And so I think it's really incumbent upon us to try to get the word out, the message, to see if this is really what people expect. When I go home and talk to people and tell them what's happening, they said, no, that isn't what we wanted. You know, we wanted to get the troops out of Germany, or we wanted to cut the waste, or we wanted to get the troops home from Korea or somewhere. They do not realize the extent of what has already been done, let alone what will happen with that super committee. And then yesterday we had another hearing where we had 3 economists, and they talked about the financial impact to our economy. We're already in a fragile economy with a 9% unemployment rate. They're talking about job losses of 1.5 million, which would increase that unemployment rate up over 10%. And I think when all the members start looking at their districts and at their homes and the lost jobs, the combination of all of this, I'm hoping, will make us sit back and take another breath and say, wait a minute, you know, is this really what we want to do? This economic problem that we're in right now, that we've been building over decades, cannot be solved in one budget cycle. And I think we have to have some real understanding of what we're doing here, and is this really what we want to do, given the risks that we see facing us around the world. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I thank you for being here, and it looks like we're going to be having votes right away, which is unfortunate, but I'm hopeful that we return after the votes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to defer all my questions to the end so we can get to as many members as we can. I'd like to now recognize the gentlelady from Guam for any questions she might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I hope everyone bears with me. I have a very bad cold. I have a couple of questions, and I understand we're coming back for a second round. All right. My first question, as I pointed out in my opening statement, Admiral Greenert stated in July that further efficiencies and budget cuts would be determined through a comprehensive strategic review. So I'm asking, to what extent are each of the services involved with OSD in developing this review? What are some of the key tenets of this review? And without a strategic plan in place, why are we proceeding with arbitrary cuts? Why not wait until such a plan is developed? So I ask this because I do not understand the rationale for the reductions in force at Naval Facilities Command Pacific, or the deactivation of the 2 CB battalions. So I guess we'll start with Admiral Ferguson.
And if the gentlelady would just yield for a second, just logistically to our members, they've called a vote, I understand now. If ever our members need to go to that vote, we will be coming back afterwards for anyone who can come. Ms. Bordallo's questions will be the last ones we take before we recess to go to the vote. So, and with that, if you'd like to answer.
Ms. Bordallo, all the services are participating at the service chief level and at the vice chief level in the forums that is the ongoing strategy review at the level of the Secretary of Defense, as is the Joint Staff. And those discussions that are ongoing presently are looking at the budget submissions that the services have done, and then looking, and they were primarily given a fiscal target, as you alluded to, for us to reach. And now they're looking at those fiscal submissions and then looking at the overall strategy as we go forward, and then we'll take action as we make those decisions through the fall prior to the budget submission about balancing between those portfolios in terms of both capabilities and capacity, and does it meet the strategy that we see going forward.
So what you're saying, Admiral, is that the reviews are not completely finished. Is that correct?
That is correct. From our perspective, the decisions regarding the final form of the budget submission are not completed yet, and those discussions are ongoing.
Mr.
And there's
Chairman,
very active participation by the service chiefs in that.
do we have time for any of the other answers, or do you?
Yes, let's let any of them answer that want to, and then, Madam, if it's okay, we'll come back to any additional questions you have.
All right.
Because you and I will be here.
Very good.
Anyone else like to respond to gentlelady's question?
Dunford?
Congresswoman, thank you. We're also, Admiral Ferguson got it exactly right. We're participants fully in the process to do the comprehensive strategic review led by Secretary Panetta. We have an opportunity to provide input in that comprehensive strategic review, and we're confident that the results of the strategic review will be the framework within which specific cuts are made. As Admiral Ferguson alluded to, necessarily what we had to do in the initial going was take a look and assume proportional cuts across the board as we went through the drill of approximately $450 billion. But again, at the end of the day, as we get towards December, the strategic review, at least the major tenets of the strategic review, will be complete. And at that point, we'll be able to talk about the specific decisions I think that Secretary Panetta will make. But our understanding is that he has not made any final decisions about the specific cuts that would be made in order to achieve that initial goal.
So pretty much the other witnesses have the same answer?
I would argue from the Army standpoint, that's exactly what we are participating in the internal debate in the building. But like when I get up in the morning and I see the futures, how they're doing on the stock market, if I had to look around town and read what all the think tanks are saying, they seem to be discounting the requirement for ground forces, which is a natural tendency after what we've been through in the last 10 years. But every other time we've done that in our history, as I indicated before, we have done so on the backs of servicemen and women, soldiers on the ground, and quite frankly, let's be honest, it has cost us lives. It cost us lives at Kasserine Pass. It cost us lives at Task Force Smith in Korea. It costs us lives every single time.
Well, and we haven't done this when a war is going on, as our chairman mentioned. What is the timeline for the review completion?
I'm going to ask you guys if you can do this. Let's hold that until we get back, because we've just got a few minutes to get over for votes. So we're going to recess until right after votes. Anyone that can come back then will be there. Gentlemen, once again, we apologize to you for the inconvenience of us having to go over there and do those votes, but that's what we're here for. So we thank you for your patience, and we were continuing with Ms. Bordallo. Ms. Bordallo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. General Breedlove, we'll begin with you. What is the timeline now for the review completion?
Ma'am, as we were walking out, we all looked at each other and came to the same conclusion. We expect that the review should wrap up in December. And then as we are working on the budget issues between now and then, as we understand the facets of the review that apply to our budget processes, we do that. And ma'am, I would just echo my three compatriots as they said, we are to this point, and we have been a part of formulating that strategy.
Thank you very much. So that's the end of December, did you say?
Ma'am, that's our collective wisdom. We all had the same date in mind.
Thank you. And then Admiral Ferguson, you didn't answer fully the question I asked about the review process. I said I did not understand the rationale for the reductions in force at the Naval Facilities Command Pacific or the deactivation of the 2 CB battalions. Could you answer that?
As we looked at force structure of the construction battalions around the globe, the initial budget submission that we prepared had a reduction in order to meet the commands of the combatant commanders. And as we size our forces, those forces are really on call to the combatant commanders to serve what we see as a future demand. And as I alluded to in the opening statement, we had to take reductions in certain elements of capacity across the force in order to meet the budget targets that we had. And then we looked at that areas of the Seabees in particular as a potential reduction. As we go forward in this review process, that's part of the effort that we're looking at as to what the final force structure of the construction battalions will be.
Thank you. Now, I have one other question. Why would Congress consider any potential changes to recruiting and retention incentives, such as military retirement and health care, or reductions to essential training accounts, when the military departments can't identify the cost of what they pay for contracted services? The Army has fulfilled the requirements of the fiscal year 2008 National Defense Authorization Act that requires contracts, or requires an inventory of contracts for services. But for nearly half a decade, while this nation has been at war, the Air Force and the Navy and the defense agencies have failed to implement this law, which would help us control the skyrocketing costs and expenditures on contracted services. So what is each of your military departments doing to reduce contracted services and work requirements instead of just reducing dollars? If you are only reducing dollars, then you are likely setting up conditions to default to contractors in light of the current civilian hiring freezes. So I guess Air Force will answer that first.
Congresswoman Bardillo, thank you for the opportunity. We are, as our other services, looking at everything we do contractually, especially as we learn the lessons of the wars that we have been in for the past 10 years. What is inherently governmental, and what should we be retaining as a blue suit requirement versus those things that we contract for, most specifically in combat zones. And every facet of what we do via contract has been reviewed to see if this is something that we either want to eliminate, do we need to repurchase and bring back into our service those things in a military way. Of course, this is in a time where we expect that our Air Force will get smaller rather than larger, so there's a lot of pressure on that process. And how does that relate to those jobs that typically our civilians also do, civilians who are a part of our Air Force? So we are in an ongoing review. We are focusing most specifically on those things that are done in combat zones and whether they should be a blue suit job or a contract job. And we are putting fiscal pressure on what we spend on contracts to help us incentivize looking at how to get at that approach.
Anyone else care to answer?
I know that in the Navy, the Secretariat, Office of the Secretariat is leading an effort that goes across all our budget submitting offices to look at service contracts in particular and other contracts that we have along the same lines that the other services are, to see what's inherently governmental and where are we paying excessive overhead and charges in that area.
Are you all in agreement?
We are doing exactly the same thing. If appointed, I believe it's a deputy secretary to handle contracts and service contracts, going through a complete review of them to understand where there's redundancies, where there's places that we, in fact, can cut, and where there are certain areas that may fall into the purview of being able to use soldiers to help us in some of these areas.
General?
Congresswoman, we're part of the same process that Admiral Ferguson described within the Department of the Navy.
When is the timeline for this review?
I'll be honest, I'm not sure, our process within the Department of Navy, I do not know what the timeline is for the review. My assumption is that it's in conjunction with the budget that will be due in December. I know we'll at least have an initial assessment of our contracting at that time, and I'll get back to you if it's going to extend past December.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
And the gentlelady from Guam is yielded back. I know she has some additional questions, but she's graciously deferred those until the end so that some of our members can get their questions in. We now have the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And gentlemen, one of the things I would hope that you'll continue to do is to inform the committee of things maybe that are in the code sections that we could take out that are increasing your cost of operations, things that we would like to pretend that we can afford but we can't, such as some of the energy mandates and other things that are running up the cost of operations. But General Breedlove, as you know, I represent Robins Air Force Base, and love to once again invite you down to the Air Logistics Center and the J-Stars, and if you'll come in hunting season, I'll make it a promise I'll make it a worthwhile venture. I'll even get you to a Georgia Tech game, although I might wear a different hat at the game than you would. But Georgia Tech would be a great opportunity for you to come as well. But the men and women in our area are very grateful for the commitment of the 3-depot strategy, and just want to again ask that question, make sure that is a commitment from the Air Force that we have to maintaining the 3 depots. Thank you so much for that. And I hope that as we go through these cuts that let me say this, as a member of Congress, I know that you know more about running your agencies, your different departments, I should say, than I do, and I hope that you'll be very forthcoming with us about what we can do to help you in doing that. And I want to be an ally for you. I'm sorry that we're going through this. I'm quite honestly embarrassed that we have more discussions in this Congress about cuts to the military than we do about cuts to social programs. I think that is something that quite honestly is carrying America down a very, very dangerous path. And I know America's tired of the wars in Afghanistan, and I know that our men and women that have been over there will continue to go, but I also know that they're ready for more time with their families. But I'm not so sure that when we come out that the world's not going to be a more dangerous place than it is today. So again, I want to thank you for everything you've done, and General Breedlove, again, thank you for your support of Robins, and if I can ever help you, please feel free to call on our office.
Congressman, thank you. And we do have a commitment to the 3 depots that we think that's the minimum. And we thank you for your support to us. And as all of us, I think, look at what we can do to address the tail of our forces to add to the tooth. And that will continue to be important as we go forward. The depots, as you know, bring a capability to all our services that is unmatched around the world to make sure that our services, our Air Force, and the airplanes that they fly are ready to do the mission, and our commitment is strong there.
Yes, sir. And the other aspect of it is that those cuts, is we need to rebuild a lot of our machines that we've used. And when every dollar that we take out of the rebuilding of those machines is a dollar that comes out of a man or a woman's pocket that's working on that assembly line. So if you want to create jobs in the country, I would respectfully submit that this is the place where you do it. The country, every citizen gets a direct benefit from a strong, well-equipped military, and every dollar that we spend in rebuilding our equipment is a dollar that goes back into an American working man, working woman's pocket to take care of their family. So thank you again for what you've done for our country, and we'll continue to stand ready, willing, and able to help you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, and to the witnesses for spending some time with us here today. First of all, I guess I wanted to ask a question about a very specific issue, which is the C-27 cargo aircraft, which it appears that a full production sort of plan has been put on hold or at least partially delayed. And obviously for the Army, that's a big issue in terms of having that lift capacity, because it's a pretty old group of Sherpas that are left there. And I just wonder if someone could give an update in terms of where that decision stands, whether it's related to the $465 billion, or are there other issues that are at work here? And I don't know whether either general wants to comment, but.
Sir, I'll be first to comment on that. I cannot speak specifically to what you mentioned about a decision on full-scale production. We'll take that for the record and get back to you. As far as the C-27 and the mission of supporting the Army and its what would probably be called the last portion of the delivery of goods to our ground forces, both Marine and Army, the Air Force has a full commitment to that mission. We will not back off of the requirement for the Air Force to meet that mission. If that mission is to be done with C-27s or C-130s, is a decision that is still pending and is a part of this ongoing budget review, but that will be worked out in the next few months.
Thank you. General, if you wanted to comment.
Well, the Army is very committed to the C-27. We feel it fills a gap. Right now, my rotary wing aviators are at about a 1-to-1 bogged well. That means boots on the ground for 12 months, and they're coming home from anywhere from 12 to 14 months. Rotary wing is the coin of the realm downrange today, and a lot of it is moving from airfield to airfield, where the C-27 could fill in a gap that we think is absolutely critical, even in Afghanistan. But if you take it to other places in the world, I think it is even more convincing. Plus, it provides a tremendous capability for homeland defense, and that is one of the things that was critical about the C-27 and its ability to get into airfields here in the United States that other aircraft can't get into in the event of homeland defense kinds of missions.
Right.
So we're totally committed to it.
And again, if we can get that follow-up, that would be great. A number of us are definitely interested in helping, push that along if there's a way that we can. Admiral, I think the chairman in his opening remarks talked about some of the shortfalls in the repair and maintenance account. And, in many respects, this should be sort of a milestone year for the Navy, and at least in one aspect, one that you probably hear from me ad nauseum around here about, which is the submarine fleet, that, we're now at 2 a year production for the first time in 22 years. We're doing, again, full startup of R&D for the Ohio replacement program. But obviously, this is a progress that could be challenged if the sequestration goes into effect. And I guess, maybe if you could talk a little bit more about Mr. Forbes' comment regarding the repair and maintenance account, in particular in terms of the impact on the fleet size and capability. And
sure, it's an important point, because the Navy, we reset in stride, and so we deploy. And in fact, over half our forces are underway, ships and submarines, on a given day, and about 40% are forward deployed. The demand for those forces is going up. So we don't have the luxury of taking them offline for prolonged periods of time. And so the maintenance funding that we have when we bring them home for their turnaround is absolutely essential to sustain that force, to reset it, and then prepare it to go, both the amphibious lift for the Marines as well as aircraft carriers, submarines, and surface ships. And so we have watched the trend in readiness over time. We're operating within acceptable levels, but as Admiral Greenert testified previously, there's a negative trend over the long term as we shrink those maintenance funds. And so as we go forward, we are absolutely committed to keeping the force whole and ensuring that those forces that are operating are well maintained and equipped and go forward. But it does present a challenge to us in an era of declining budgets.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank all of you for being here. The DOD, in this current year budget, had projected fuel cost per barrel of oil to be $131, and DLA has recently pegged it now at $166 a barrel, and it's projecting that level will be sustained throughout the balance of this fiscal year. How are y'all going to deal with that? General Breedlove, start with you, and let's go down the other.
Sir, thank you for the opportunity to talk to it. We do have an aggressive program in our fuel savings, and they're looking at numerous opportunities, both existing technologies and new technologies to get after it. A good example is recoring of our C-130 engines. If we can get to a new core of those aircraft, on those aircraft engines, running cooler and running more efficiently, the fuel savings is quite important. Simple things that we're doing across our aircraft fleet, like winglets on our larger aircraft, and changing as we buy new aircraft some of the exterior hull designs, cuts down on a little bit of fuel. You would think that that is not significant, but we understand, as you do as well, sir, that the Air Force is the #1 user of fuel in the United States. And so every little bit that we can cut saves money to roll back into things that are really needed in our force. So we are attacking this because it is the most important thing to get at for Air Force savings in energy.
Congressman, thanks very much for the question. We share your concern about that, what I perceive to be a critical vulnerability or reliance on fuel, not only from a cost perspective, but also from a strained lines of logistics as we see in Afghanistan, the criticality of getting fuel to our forces and what that does in terms of putting people in harm's way to deliver that fuel. All of our units that are on the ground right now in Afghanistan have been fielded with renewable energy sources. That started as an experiment, and within about 14 months it has now become every unit that goes over there has renewable energy. And that includes not only solar panels, it includes tent liners, it includes low energy or energy efficient lighting. As we look at our requirements, as we acquire new equipment, fuel efficiency is a critical part of our requirements documents as we seek to have new equipment in the future. And then as a whole, within the Department of the Navy, the Secretary of the Navy has led a very aggressive effort to replace our fossil fuels with some alternative fuel sources and other initiatives in developing technologies that might be available to release us from truly the shackles of fossil fuels, again, not only from a cost perspective, but from a challenge in delivering that to the battlefield.
Well, but I guess I'm hearing from both of y'all that this 25% increase in cost that was not budgeted is something you think you're going to be able to adequately deal with?
Congressman, what we're doing is we're making choices. I mean, there's other ways that we increasingly rely on simulation, as an example, to develop proficiency for both our pilots and for our ground forces. We'll make trade-offs within our operation and maintenance accounts to ensure that we can maintain a high state of readiness and still pay all of our bills. I'm not going to say it's not going to be difficult. It's going to be a challenge. This does exacerbate an already stressed operations and maintenance account. But right now, we're trying to work within the resources that we have, again, to ensure that our folks maintain proper training before they deploy. And we have no issue with delivering fuel, obviously, to our forces that are forward deployed as our #1 priority.
Okay. Admiral.
We are also a part of the very aggressive energy efforts led by the Secretary for all our basing. But I think more to your point is the challenge in this fiscal year that we're facing. And should the current prices be sustained, and lately we've seen them start to come down a bit, but if they were sustained for the entire year for the Department of the Navy, the shortfall would be around $1.1 billion that we would face in fuel costs. We would have to offset those by reductions in other areas of the operations and maintenance account to pay for that, or seek a reprogramming or other action from the Congress to address it. And because it is an execution year, the horizon of many of our efficiency initiatives won't generate those savings in order to generate them this year. But what we won't do is reduce the commitment of those operating forces to the combatant commanders and be able to sustain what we need to train and operate forward.
I have little to add except for the fact that the Army is working in 3 specific areas in operational energy for our forces deployed. And again, we'll do whatever we have to do and balance whatever accounts we have to ensure that they have what they need. But we're looking at ways to reduce their reliance. One of them is replacing all our generators with new fuel-efficient generators, and the fuel savings alone downrange is huge. Both the request for proposals for the ground combat vehicle, the infantry fighting vehicle, and the JLTV, the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, include energy savings. And I think that is a big selling point when you look at the total life cycle costs of those vehicles once we bring them on board. And at post camps and stations, we're working with a net zero pilot at least 3 installations. We're using solar at the National Training Center and other locations to help with our energy needs. And also, the Human Resource Command and the new Personnel Command of the Army out of Fort Knox, Kentucky, use geothermal to produce both its heating and cooling in the summertime.
Thank you all.
Gentlelady from Hawaii, St. Lucia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My questions are first directed at General Dunford. By the way, I think we owe you a happy birthday to the Marine Corps. You guys are all celebrating in the next couple of days or so. Let me first begin with statements that you've made in your statement. I'm curious about the fact that you said that our nation needs an expeditionary force that can respond to today's crisis with today's force today. Now, first, I'd like you to explain what you meant by the expeditionary force, and also then tell me, you're talking about today's crisis with today's force today, but I think what we're looking at as we look forward in a 10-year budget, what is the force to look like in the year 2020? And those are, of course, the discussions that we've been having with Secretary Panetta as well as General, the new chief. So if you could proceed accordingly.
Congresswoman, first question concerned expeditionary, and what that means is a couple of things. Number one is we wouldn't be reliant on political access being provided by somebody else. If we needed to go someplace, naval forces are uniquely capable of being able to do that. We're capable of operating in an austere environment. So when we come someplace, we come with the water, the fuel, the supplies that our Marines and sailors need to accomplish the mission. And so that's, in general terms, what we mean by expeditionary. With regard to today's forces today, as I alluded to in my opening statement, physical presence matters. And physical presence matters for a couple of reasons. Number one, it absolutely shows a sign of our economic and our military commitment to a particular region. It deters potential adversaries. It assures our friends. And as you start moving up the range of military operations, it also allows you to respond in a timely manner to crises. Many times you have hours, if not minutes, to respond to a crisis, and you certainly can't do that from the continent of the United States, and naval forces are there on the scene, able to be able to do that. The other thing that it does is it allows you to buy time and space for decision makers. When you have some forces there, they can contain a crisis as the rest of the joint force gets prepared to respond to something that may be a bit larger than the crisis that's being dealt with on the scene. So from my perspective, when you look at expeditionary forces and you talk about responding to today's crisis today, what you really have with forward deployed naval forces, which was what I was talking about, is the ability to turn the rheostat up from day-to-day shaping operations, day-to-day engagement with our allies. In the sticker price of that same force, you can then respond to a crisis. And in the sticker price of that same force, you can then enable the joint force to respond to something larger on the size of a contingency.
Now, you also went on to say about, regarding to Secretary Panetta's announcement, that he directed the Department to cut in half the time it takes to achieve readiness. Now, I assume that that's one of the reasons what you're speaking to here. However, isn't the underlying assumption that we all have is that we know where we're going to be? So isn't there also have to be some kind of analysis that if you're going to be ready to go within a couple of hours or whatever it is, that we know where we would most likely be, that your services are most likely going to be needed? For example, I'm from Hawaii, so I have Kaneohe. I mean, if you're going to be deployed in Afghanistan, it's not going to be a couple of hours. So what is the, I guess, the perceived theater as far as you're concerned as to where, and we have to make these choices because of the fact that we just don't have money for everybody. So where is it that we're going to put our resources, or where, if you had your magic wand, you would put your resources?
Congresswoman, it's pretty clear, I think, to all of us, and it's certainly been stated by the Secretary of Defense, that the Pacific is the future of our country from both an economic and a military perspective. That's the number one priority. We will still, for the foreseeable future, for many, many years to come, have security challenges in the United States Central Command from Egypt to Pakistan, and so that's another area where you'd expect to see significant military presence. But I would offer to you that if there's one thing that we're not very good at, it's predicting the future. And so as sure as we talk about the priority of the Pacific and then the challenges that exist in the United States Central Command, someplace else will cause us to respond, and we don't know where that will be. And so when the combatant commanders asked for 4 deployed naval forces to be out there on a routine basis, each of them asked for that. And they asked for that as a mitigation to the risk of the unknown. And that's what I believe we provide. So again, from a priority perspective, certainly we'll see the preponderance of our effort and our commitment to be in the Pacific Command and the Central Command, but priority can't be exclusivity, and we're still going to have to satisfy the requirements of the other combatant commanders, again, to do not only the day-to-day shaping, but as importantly, as a hedge against the risk of the unknown.
I'm out of time, but if you could respond to me in writing, I'm curious as to what an expeditionary force would be comprised of, and I'm talking about ships, helicopters, amphibious vehicles, whatever that. If you could give me an idea so that when we vote on whether things are no longer necessary, I have an idea whether or not we know what we're talking about.
Congressman, I'll be glad to do that. And the good news for you is that there is expeditionary capabilities on the islands of Hawaii, and they're available in the Pacific in time of crisis. But I'd be happy to get back to you on the detailed organization of Marine Expeditionary Forces, as well as the naval forces that are absolutely critical to our ability to do our job.
Thank you very much.
And I'd be glad to do the same for the Army.
And the Air Force? And if you call it something other than expeditionary force, you can tell me that too. Thank you very much.
I just have to underline something that was said. We just don't know. We have been 100% right in something, and that's never getting it right.
General Dempsey said the same thing.
It is true. It is true, and all you have to do is look at history. And when we don't have a balanced force that can meet wherever U.S. national interests are threatened, where the National Command Authority says that we must provide military force, that's when we get ourselves into trouble. And I think that's very important to look at the history of how we have done. We're repeating a cycle here that is something that has happened many, many times in our history.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience. We've got just a few more questions, but I know that General Breedlove has a hard stop that he has to make. I'm going to ask the gentlelady from Guam if she can ask a quick question of him, and then I just have one if you have the time before you have to leave.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this is for you, General Breedlove. What shortages in critical skill sets in your respective services, well, actually, a question for all of you, are you already experiencing because of manpower reductions already taken? And what impacts would you anticipate from further reductions? How are these shortages affecting your warfighting capability? And General, why don't you go first, since we know that the Air Force has experienced shortages in more than a dozen enlisted NCO and officer skill sets, especially in the aircraft maintenance area.
And I'm going to ask General Breedlove if he'd address that, and then we'll come back to you, gentlemen, after General Breedlove is left, if that's okay. General.
Ma'am, thank you for the question, and you are absolutely right. There are several skill sets, both in our officer and enlisted corps, that have come under pressure. And I think it talks to capacity, much as General Dunford talked to capacity earlier. In our Air Force, some portions of our Air Force, such as our lift and others, have a good capacity to handle the first fight, and then will be stretched a little bit on the second fight. But already, in a scenario where we have one full-up war fight, or where we're engaged just like we are now in Afghanistan and Iraq, we're already stressed in some very key areas, and you mentioned several of them. In our enlisted corps, our cryptolinguists, we're growing so fast in intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance that we're struggling to keep abreast of the requirement for those people who take the data that is coming into the system and break it down for use by our ground forces and others. Our battlefield airmen that were built for a certain model during the Colder War, we're catching up to the requirements for our battlefield airmen. All of the units on the ground are supported by those TACPs, those EOD, those air combat control folks, CCT, meaning our special tactics folks, and our pararescue. And those are all under pressure now in a one-war scenario, and we have to work on those. Special Operations Weather and our security forces, as we have picked up more and more of the responsibility of defense around bases, are all under pressure. In our officer career field, some of the things that you would have never thought about, just simply because of the way that the services do differently. We have a lot of senior contracting NCOs and officers. The other services typically do these with civilians. And so our expeditionary officers in some of these critical career fields like airfield ops, contracting, and some of our specific airfield civil engineering sets are all under pressure and are things that we need to move forward on. As we constrict our force, and we will across these budget battles, we're going to be keeping our eye on growing those. So the Air Force will come under pressure, I think, in other areas, but we will have to keep an eye on those very critical ones that I've mentioned so that we can grow to a better and more acceptable level of risk in those areas.
And
Thank you very much, General.
And we'll come back to that question as soon as the General has just answered one more question. General, since the Korean War, it's my understanding that there's not been a single soldier or Marine who lost his life in combat due to a threat from the air. That's 58 years, and I may be inaccurate, but that's a statement that was given to me. Oftentimes, we call that air dominance. If we were to move to those cuts that sequestration could bring about, would that put into question our continued ability to have that kind of air dominance?
Mr. Chairman, I would never beg to correct, but I would just correct in one way. We have, since the Korean War, suffered an air attack by Scuds and some others who have taken the lives of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on the ground. So just with that small correction, I think the point that you make is the one that is often talked about, and that is to fixed-wing air to our opponents' air forces, our naval air forces. We have not lost or been under attack since the latter part of the Korean War, and that is something that our Air Force says, centered on our Air Force, but certainly our Marine Air and Naval Air, and to some degree even the rotary ring of the Army. We have put together what you call air dominance across the years to give our ground forces the ability to react and to fight under that protection. I give you one small example that my friend from the Army will chuckle about, and that is when I was an ALO in Europe during the late 80s, and we would practice for the big war on the plains of northern Germany. We would go out in our brigade formation when I was a brigade TAC-P, and when we came under attack from supposedly Soviet force air, we would do herringbone maneuvers and all kinds of things to react to so that the air defenders could set up and defend us and so forth. And we have now come to an age where we are so used to and so enabled by that air dominance that the joint team brings to the battlefield that I can't remember even talking about a herringbone maneuver in the last few years. Our situation on the ground and on the sea would change drastically were it not for the joint air forces that bring this capability. Certainly we will all be under pressure under the new budget regimes, and especially if we go to a sequester. And I would just say that I think that without starting a long conversation about areas of the world where we talk about the paradigm of area A2AD, anti-access area denial events, so that our opponents build an area that is so constrictive to our ability to enter the area or fight in the area due to their ability to put up air defenses, sea defenses, ship defenses that keep us at range, that the future budget scenario, which would severely constrict our ability to approach those requirements, those weapons, those new aircraft or other weapons that would give us a capability in this A2A2 or A2AD anti-access sort of environment. I think that's where the pressure will be. And quite frankly, in some portions of the world, if we are not able to break that A2AD environment, I believe that we will be in a position where we will not be able to guarantee that air dominance or air supremacy to our sea and land forces as we operate over them.
Okay. General, thank you so much for being here. I know you have to go, and we are excusing you from the hearing now, and please know how proud we are of your service and the men and women who serve under you in the United States Air Force, and thank you for being with us today.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. And gentlemen, we're not going to hold you very much longer, but just a couple things we'd like to get for the record so that we can get to other members. I want to yield back to Ms. Bordallo so we can finish her question that she had for the general stance.
We'll start with the general.
Hey, Congresswoman, getting back to our current shortfalls and then the impact of future reductions. I mentioned in my opening statement that our forward deployed Marines have all that they need with regard to training, equipment, and leadership to accomplish the mission. That's our absolute #1 priority. The cost of ensuring that they have all that they need has been felt by those units back at home station. In fact, about 2/3 of our units that are back at home station are currently in a state of degraded readiness. And that, of course, impacts on our ability to deal with another contingency or certainly the unexpected. There is also a cost when we come back out of Afghanistan to reset the force, to address those equipment shortfalls and to refresh the equipment that will be coming out of Afghanistan. And we currently estimate that bill at about $3 billion. And in some ways, that's a good news story because a couple of years ago, that bill was in excess of $15 billion. And with the help of Congress over the last couple of years, we've been able to do some resetting even as we continue to support operations both in Iraq and Afghanistan. So as we look to the future, I'd be concerned about two things. One, I'd be concerned that we actually do reset the force. We actually do address those deficiencies and replace that equipment that is worn out from operations in Afghanistan as we move to the future. The second thing I'd be concerned about is our ability to continue to modernize and keep pace with modern threats. And over and above the reset cost, which really gets us back to the force that we had before we went to Afghanistan, replacing that equipment, we need to keep a pace and modernize our equipment. And I'd be concerned that further reductions would preclude our ability to modernize. And over time, we would get back to that same state we were in the 1970s where our equipment was antiquated and worn out. And that's exactly what we want to try to avoid. And again, that's one of the key aspects of hollowness.
Thank you very much, Admiral.
As we look at the manpower issues, the force is under pressure. Our average deployments, as I alluded to earlier, 50% of our ships are underway or stretching out to about 7 months. Some ships are doing longer in order to meet operational commitments overseas. And so they're under stress, and within that area, we have a group of very critical specialists, and I'm thinking of our nuclear operators, our linguists, our cryptologists, those involved in highly technical fields like acoustics and aviation maintenance and electronics, where because the outside economy is presently not hiring to the level where they could, think about leaving, they're staying with us. And my concern as we go forward into this environment, which echoes my fellow vice chiefs, is concerning this element of keeping faith with the force that we have and ensuring that we sustain their compensation in an area under high stress so that should the economy, and hopefully it turns soon, gets better, we might lose those individuals for retention in the future. So the retention element is one that we watch very carefully. We're enjoying great recruiting right now from the nation with the highest quality force we've ever had, and we're very appreciative of that. But I think in the long-term manpower, it's our highly skilled, critical specialties that we're most concerned about for the future.
Thank you. From the Army, General?
Recruiting and retention has never been stronger. It's just absolutely amazing. And if you would have told me this 10 years ago, before we got into this fight, I would have said there's no way we could hold this together for 10 years and have it be as strong as it is today. It is absolutely amazing. But at the same time, again, as the guy who gets paid to worry about things, I also believe it's fragile. I worry about rotary wing aviators. That is an area, as I indicated earlier, that my folks are spending 12 months in theater, coming home for 12 to 14, maybe 15 months right now, and then right back down. I've got aviators that have got 6 and 7 deployments. We are increasing our contracting, uniformed contracting corps. The Secretary of the Army has made a decision to add additional uniformed contracting specialists, officers, and senior non-commissioned officers and warrants to the United States Army, even as we downsize the force, because we realize it's absolutely critical. And electronic warfare is also an area where we're adding to our roles, even as we downsize. I would like to pile on to what General Dunford said. What really concerns me is in the modernization area. I will tell you, the ground combat vehicle, the infantry fighting vehicle, is absolutely critical for the United States Army. We are not talking about going into full-rate production at this particular time on the ground combat vehicle. All we're trying to do is get from milestone A to milestone B to see what industry can give us at a point where we can make a decision 2 to 2.5 years from now whether to go to a new build that industry brings us. Well, at the same time in that 2.5-year period, we're going to look at some off-the-shelf solutions to an infantry fighting vehicle. There are many. And then when those two lines of effort converge 2 to 2.5 years from now, we'll make a cost-informed decision on what we can afford. But to cut that off now, to not provide us the ability to do that, will only put us 2 years behind a modernization program that is absolutely critical to the Army. I would argue, I think we're doing the same thing with the JLTV, the Joint Light Tactical Wheel Vehicle. We are looking at the possibility of recapping Humvees and what that would cost. At the same time, we have entered into a partnership with the Marines and really driven down the requirements on JLTV so that we believe we can buy this vehicle for somewhere between $200,000 and $240,000 a vehicle. We've done that in partnership to drive down those requirements, but that too will enter into what they call a technical development phase, and it will come together with what's being looked at with the recap of Humvees, and there'll come a point down the road, not probably more than 2 years or shorter than 2 years, where we will be able to make a decision on what's smarter. Do we recap Humvees or do we go with a new JLTV? I just think it's absolutely essential that we be allowed to continue that critical work, or we will end up with a force that is not modernized. And a force that is not modernized is an unbalanced force, and in the end, it will cost us lives.
Thank you very much. That's been very informative.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, one of the things that all three of you have talked about, and first of all, I compliment you, all three of your services have done a great job in retaining your troops and recruiting. And I've looked and I've seen the pride in each of your eyes as you look at the products that you're able to train and turn out. But I also hear you using a phrase that only the public always understand, which is keeping faith with those troops. And part of that keeping faith is the compensation package. And each of you told me privately it's kind of a holistic approach. It's more than just the dollars. It's everything. It's the commissaries that they go to. It's the schools that they use. It's the programs that they have as an overall package. When someone sits down and determines whether or not they're going to re-up or whether they're going to sign up in the first place. The question I have for you is, if you could elaborate for me a little bit your concerns with this keeping faith, and specifically I want to ask you this. When we had a major policy change recently in the military with don't ask, don't tell, and I'm not asking you to weigh in on for that or against that, either one, but we did an in-depth study, surveys, focus groups that were done before we implemented that policy. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit what the Army did, the Navy did, the Marine Corps did in terms of that policy, focus group surveys, et cetera, and then compare that to what we have done with the compensation packages. Have we done any similar types of analysis of that? And General Corelli, why don't we start with you?
Well, we haven't, because the proposals have been coming from every direction, and you are so correct that this is a holistic review. It needs to include those benefits that you're going to have for medical care, retirement, educational benefits. They all have to be looked at in a holistic package and not looked at as individual programs, because they're all interrelated. We need to do those focus groups. We need to know what the educational benefits mean to the 19-year-old kid coming out of high school, coming into the United States Army. What role did that play in his decision to sign up during a time of war? It was very interesting when the Defense Business Board published their plan for looking at military retirement. The Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff went out and talked to soldiers. And they were expecting to get questions based on the Army Times article from captains, majors, lieutenant colonels, and colonels, and senior non-commissioned officers. That wasn't it. They got it from a 19-year-old kid who said, Mr. Secretary, what are you doing to my retirement? Now, we know the numbers, less than 70%, 70% of those will never reach retirement, but it leads one to believe that that retirement package had a role in this individual making a decision to join us during a time of war. And if we go back to what we just talked about recruiting and retention, these are huge in our ability to be able to maintain this force over time. So I would only echo what you say, Chairman. We really need to take the time to look at this. We understand it needs to be looked at, yes, but please let's do it holistically and let's take time to put together a total package and understand where that's going to take us.
General, I know, but for the record, how many years have you served in the Army?
Just short of 40.
And
I don't look it, do I?
No, you don't. I would have thought 19. But with all of those years' experience, would you say that it would be foolish, at least unpredictable for us, to begin to launch off on some of these compensation packages before we've done that analysis to what it's going to do to the force?
Yes.
Okay. Admiral Ferguson.
I would echo General Corelli's comments and say that when I go out and I travel to the force and I visit, it is the #1 question that I get. And part of the benefit of the review process that happened under the study for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was that we not only did focus groups, but we allowed a very methodical review of the policy issues, an ability to socialize discussions with the force that allowed people to work through and air the questions and things that they had about that policy development. And it was a pretty thorough process of both surveys, policy development, and analysis, and communication. I think in an issue that's as important as retirement to our force and for their decision about retention, that a similar type review of that thoroughness and nature would be important, as well as the ability to have the force be communicated with on the elements that are under consideration. I just think that's essential for the long-term viability of the force.
Thanks, Admiral. General?
Chairman, thank you for that question, and I would agree with the characterization that you laid out with regard to compensation, General Corelli and Admiral Ferguson, and just summarize with the key point, and that is this. There's been many proposals about compensation that are out there that talk about how much money we'll save. I've not seen a single proposal that provides the analysis on what the effect on the force would be. And at the end of the day, what compensation is about, it's about our ability to continue to recruit and retain the high-quality force that we have had in harm's way over the past 10 years. And if you play it forward, I mean, it really is about a conversation that some young sergeant may have with his spouse a couple of years from now. And the spouse will say, hey, your 4 years are up. What are we going to do? You know, you've been deployed 2 or 3 times. You've been away from home 180 days out of every 365 days. This is really hard. You're missing many of the key milestones of your children's lives. Are we going to stay in or are we going to get out? And at that point, the family's going to look holistically at the housing, the education for their children. They're going to look at medical support. They're going to look at behavioral health support that exists. They're going to look at some of the intangibles like, is their service valued? Do they have respect in the community? Do their leaders treat them with trust? And so all of that is really the intangible and the tangible aspects that cause people to serve. And when we talk about compensation, we need to talk about it in that light. It needs to be a holistic approach to ensure that at the end of the day, when that sergeant has that conversation, that the compensation for his service and the value that we place in his service exceeds the challenges and the risks that we asked him to endure.
General, when I ask you the same question I asked General Corelli, and despite your young, youthful looks, how many years have you served the United States Marine Corps?
I have served, Chairman, a mere 35 years in active duty.
And in that 35 years, with all of your experience and the capacity, how detrimental do you think it would be to your force if we launch out changing these compensation packages before we've done these kind of reviews?
Chairman, I think it would be reckless to make changes in our compensation packages right now without an understanding of the effect. And I think each of the gentlemen that's sitting at this table, and most of us all remember the quality of force that we had in the late 1970s. And that's exactly what we don't want to go back to. As long as our nation has made a decision that we're going to have an all-volunteer force, then the critical aspect is that we have to make sure that the compensation meets the requirements of the all-volunteer force. And so whether it's expensive or not really is relative to what you get from it. And how much it costs may or may not be expensive when you think about it in those terms. And from my perspective, again, the Chairman has said we should look at compensation. We should study compensation. I'm not for a minute suggesting that there may not be rational and good changes that we might make in compensation. But again, at the end of the day, we have to do that in a way that ensures that we continue to recruit and retain that high-quality force. And folks who lose sight of that, I think, are actually heading down a path they have no idea what's on the other end.
I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, and we hear a lot of discussions, both in Congress and across the country today, if we were to not be forward deployed, if we would pull all of our troops, all of our assets from across the globe and bring them all back into the United States, that would be a more inexpensive way for us to conduct our national defense and our foreign policy. General Dunford, can you tell us how that would impact the Marines if that was done, and whether or not you think that would be a good policy for us to undertake?
I could, Chairman. First of all, as I mentioned when the Congresswoman from Hawaii asked me, our forward deployed and forward based forces, provide an unmistakable sign of our commitment both economically and militarily in a region, and they contribute to regional stability. Being forward deployed and forward engaged, again, allows us to shape the environment as opposed to react to the environment. Being forward deployed and forward engaged allows us to respond to crises in a timely manner, and being forward deployed and forward engaged certainly deters, our potential adversaries. To give you an example from a time and space perspective of the impact of pulling back to the continental United States, if you took the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force that is currently located on mainland Japan and Okinawa, and soon to have elements on Guam, if you took that force and moved it back to the continental United States, in the event of a crisis or contingency, Chairman, it would take months to move that force to the Western Pacific, and 7 consecutive miracles in terms of synchronizing the planes, trains, and automobiles associated with moving that force.
Good. Admiral Ferguson.
Just a little over a week ago, we had an International Sea Power Symposium in Newport, Rhode Island. Over 100 navies were represented around the globe, and nearly all were chiefs of their Navy that came to talk. An issue that they raised repeatedly was, will you still be here with us? Are you going to be forward and operate? And each of them, in their various regions of the world, articulated the need for stability against piracy, to provide missile defense ships, to provide a shield for our allies in Europe, a nuclear deterrent that's forward, to be able to operate with our partners, the Marine Corps, be able to project power, both from a carrier air wing, from a submarine and SSGN, or from the amphibious forces. But the primary element is that stability and surety to our allies and the ability to be forward and to respond quickly. The demand for naval forces forward from the commanders has never been higher, both in Central Command and the Western Pacific, but also in other regions, be it counter-drug or in Africa where humanitarian assistance is needed, or to support special forces from international waters. So we see that pulling back those forces and their presence would abdicate the nation's maritime leadership in the world and would really reduce our ability to influence, shape events around the globe and provide stability.
Thanks, Admiral. General?
We understand adjustments are going to have to be made to forward deployed Army forces, but at the same time we think it's absolutely critical. We think it's absolutely critical from an engagement standpoint. The relationships that are made when a young captain meets another captain from another service, and they grow up together in their own services and have those connections back and forth, are absolutely critical, particularly in a strategy that is going to rely on the ability of allies to assist us. Without that forward engagement, that living and working and training with those forces, we lose so much. So I would be very, very careful at taking a look at just what the green eye shade people would look at when they look at forward deployed and stationed forces. I would look at some of the second and third order effects and the intangibles of the relationships that are built and how critical those relationships are in a time of crisis. It's always good to have someone on the other side you can call, and many of these engagements provide that to us.
One of the other discussions that we've had up here from a lot of people, we sometimes get lost in the nomenclature and the syntax, and people will say, well, if we make all these cuts, we just simply have to come back and we redo our strategy so that we can't do as many missions. The chairman was kind enough to have, or smart enough, I guess, to have the 3 former chairmen testify before a full committee a couple weeks ago, I guess it was. We had former Chairman Hunter and Skelton, and also former Chairman John Warner from the Senate. I asked each of them, what warning would you want to give to our committee or to the Congress from all of your years of experience? And Congressman Skelton said that throughout his tenure in Congress, there were 13 contingencies. 12 of those were not predicted. Only one of them was predicted. No matter what we do with our strategy in terms of changing that, do any of you know a time when any of your services were asked by the President of the United States to go perform a mission that you said, no, we can't do it because it's not in our strategy? General Crowley?
No.
Yeah.
And I will give you an example from my own career. When I was a division commander, I'd spent a year in Iraq. I came back and went into a reset phase. I was back for 3 months when Katrina hit the continental United States. I was told at a time that I was at the lowest readiness level of probably any unit in the United States Army to pick up a brigade and send it to New Orleans from Fort Hood, Texas, within 24 hours. When I asked the question, are you kidding me? We just got back from Iraq. I was said, you don't understand. You pick up your brigade, you be in New Orleans in 24 hours. We will never fail you. We will always do it. But if we're not trained, if we're not equipped, if we don't have the proper force structure, the results will not be good. They will not be good.
And General Crowley, would it be fair to say that when we say the results would not be good, that includes the number of men and women that come back from?
And that's exactly what I was trying to show in my historical examples of the Kasserine Pass and Task Force Smith. No one ever said, no, we're not going to take Task Force Smith into Korea. They said, Roger, we'll do it. But they went in with incomplete infantry battalions, a poorly equipped and trained force, and they took 40% casualties. That's what happens. We'll never say no. That, I think, we all will promise you. But the key is the results when we do that mission.
Admiral Ferguson.
I would echo that. In the history of the nation, we've never said no, and we won't say no into the future. And so, our forces forward, they will be as ready as we can make them. And we will operate forward, we'll be ready, and we would take risk at home rather than in any way keep the forces that we have able to achieve the mission.
Would you agree that if that risk is increased, that risk means the risk of the number of men and women that may come back from that mission if we send them in unprepared and unready?
I think all of us in the service accept that risk as part of the business of wearing this uniform and serving the nation. And we accept that as part of the calculus, and that our mission as leaders is to make them as ready, to give them the equipment, and minimize that as much as possible.
General Dunford.
Chairman, saying no to the Commander-in-Chief is not in our DNA. We'll never do that, and we never have. I would agree with what you and General Corelli and Admiral Ferguson said. We'll never say no, but if we do go into harm's way without adequate equipping, without adequate training, without adequate leadership, the cost of going into harm's way without being ready, which is what we've articulated here today, is the requirement to keep our forces at a high state of readiness, not to have hollow forces, to be prepared for the unexpected. But the cost of going into harm's way without having been attentive to balanced readiness is absolutely the cost of young Americans.
One of the things I mentioned that we asked the former chairman was if you could give us one warning about these cuts that are coming down and the things that are happening. What would the warning be you'd give to this subcommittee, that we could give to the full committee, that we could give to Congress? From all of your years of experience, what concerns you most? And with that, please feel free at this time to tell us anything that we've left out that you feel you want to get on this record so that we can give you that opportunity to do that. And then I'm going to wrap up by letting the chairman and Ms. Bordallo have any final comments that they might want to make. Anybody want to start?
My biggest fear is that we will not be able to, and we understand we're going to have to downsize the Army. We already know we're going to 520,000. That is in the books, 27,000 in force structure and 22,000 in a temporary and strength increase. I am concerned about losing the entire temporary and strength increase because I have such a high number of individuals that are in the disability evaluation system, and it's taking me way too long to get through that. I won't go into it in great detail, but I would hope someday we'll look at the disability evaluation system and look to design a system built for an all-volunteer force rather than a system that currently is built for a conscript force. I think that's a huge issue out there when it comes to readiness that we have to look at. But my fear is we won't do this in a balanced way. Whatever size force we have at the end has got to be modernized, it has to be well-trained and maintained. That is absolutely critical. And besides shrinking our force, the real mistake we have made in the past is to take some kind of solace in the fact that from the Army standpoint, we maintained a force structure of X, you name it. After World War II, it was 530,000 folks. But it wasn't the size of the force that got Task Force Smith into trouble. It was the modernization of that force and the training of that force that got it into trouble. That's what caused the problem. That's what caused the 40% casualty rate. So I just ask as we look at this, that we do it with those three rheostats that I talked about earlier on, that we look at force structure, we look at modernization, and we look at training and maintaining that force and ensure that whatever size the Army is at the end of this thing, that it is a well-trained, modernized force that can do what the nation asks it to do.
I firmly believe America is a maritime nation faced by two oceans, and our prosperity and our standing in the world in many ways is ensured by the naval forces that we're able to deploy forward. Around the globe, potential competitors are working to negate that advantage through anti-access aerial denial capabilities, and we have to be able to pace that in the modernization of our forces as we go forward. Our allies and our friends look to us to provide stability in the global common, that is the sea, and we've assured them that we're committed to do so. And I think that's an important point of our security as we go forward. As I think about the future, the element of balance within the naval portfolio is important. It is about ensuring the forces that we have, whatever level that we set on those from the strategy and the fiscal environment, are extraordinarily capable to meet that threat. They're able to be forward. They're ready with adequate weapons, people, training, such that it delivers to the President and to the nation options that he can use forward, away from our shores. As I leave you with, thoughts or things that really affect me, I had the occasion to attend the memorial service for the SEALs who were killed in that crash in Afghanistan. And the strength of their families and the commitment of those individuals who are operating on a 700-day cycle, and they're gone for about 500 days of it. They've been doing this for 10 years of war. That core of people in the United States who are willing to raise their right hand and serve, to me, we can never lose that. And that's the most essential element. Thank you.
General Dunford.
Chairman, what concerns me is really what I opened up with, and that is that we'll make these cuts without an adequate appreciation of the strategic implications, the implications on our readiness, or the implications of breaking faith, as Admiral Ferguson talked about. And also, what concerns me is that folks would think that if we get it wrong, well, we can just simply fix it in a year or two. That's not possible, particularly in the latter category. If we break the trust of our Marines, sailors, soldiers, and airmen today, it will be decades before we get it back. And so some of the decisions that we make, both from an industrial base perspective, but as importantly from a human factors perspective, are decisions we can't possibly get wrong. We're not going to get it exactly right, but we can't afford to get it wrong. And so I'm concerned about those two things, and I think probably the last thing is that people would assume that if the United States of America reduces in capability, well, somebody else will just be out there to pick up the slack. Chairman, I don't know who that would be. And I think who will pick up the slack are people who do not have interests that are consistent with the United States of America, and I think we'll assume extreme risk in regions that are critical to the United States if we're not there, we're not forward deployed, we're not forward engaged, we're not assuring our allies, and we're not deterring our potential foes. Those are the things that concern me.
Thank you, General. And now we've been joined again by our Chairman. I'd just like to ask if he has any final questions or comments he'd like to offer.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not to drag this out, but I had a call several weeks ago from a young man that I watched grow up. His dad is a good friend of mine, and he's an Air Force officer. He's a physician stationed down in San Antonio. And I guess he'd been talking to his dad, and his dad told him to call me. And he said he's been in 12 years, he's looking at re-enlisting, and he wanted to know, what can I expect? What is my future? What will be my retirement? He's enjoying the service, but he's very concerned. And I couldn't tell him. You know, I don't know what his future is, because I don't know what all of this that we're going through. And I was down at Camp Lejeune a couple of weeks ago, and I was visiting with some Marines and their wives. The wives spoke up, and they're very concerned. Same questions. You know, what happens on, can we look forward to a career? I've seen this movie before. When I was pretty new in the Congress, I was going up to visit West Point, and I had a lieutenant colonel with me. They don't let us go anywhere alone. And his dad had been the chief of the Army. No, his grandpa had been the chief of the Army. His dad had been the youngest brigadier in the Army. And then he suffered a stroke, and that ended his career. And this lieutenant colonel, his whole life, that was all he ever wanted to do, was serve in the military. And he was being riffed because his class at West Point, there were about 3-year class. This was the drawdown under Bush and Clinton earlier in the 90s. And he didn't want to leave, and he didn't have a choice. And when we got to West Point, we were greeted by a lieutenant colonel there, and he was also being ripped. It didn't matter as much to him. I mean, he didn't want to leave, but to the first guy, it meant a lot. And, you know, I thought, that does break faith as far as I'm concerned. You start somebody out on a career, you send them to West Point or Annapolis or Air Force Academy, and you make certain promises, and then you break those promises. That's basically what's happened. And then I think about these young men that are going outside the wire over in Afghanistan every day on patrol, and if they're having to think about what's happening about my future, instead of concentrating on IEDs or on snipers or on ambushes or just not being able to be totally focused on their job, that puts them at risk today, needlessly. And
Mr. Chairman, we thank you for those comments and for that passion that you have for our men and women who serve in our military. Ms. Bordallo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank General Dunford for his comments about the Pacific area and how important it is that we continue to increase our force structure. This is a troubled area. And Mr. Chairman, Mr. McKeon, and our chairman of our subcommittee, I live there. That's my home. And I want to know that we Americans living in Guam and other islands surrounding us are protected. And to all of you who gave us information this afternoon, I found it very valuable, and how important it is to keep up the strength of our military forces. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, to all three of you, we thank you for your service to our country, for the men and women who serve under you. And I think you can tell from listening to your testimony, you can tell from listening to the comments up here, this is not just about procurement. It's not just about aircraft carriers. It all does come down to individuals and those men and women who serve under you. All of us have those stories, stories that make this very, very real. Mine was a young Marine, Colby Childers. Colby, all he wanted to do from the time he was 11 was serve in the Marine Corps. When he was 18, he became a Marine. When he was 19, I was speaking at his funeral. And Colby had 2 tattoos. One of them was an American flag, red, white, and blue, and one of them was a family. And I was thinking at that funeral, as I looked, this is the absolute best that America has to give. And one of the things that we've got to make certain of, General Crowley, you mentioned it, we don't break that faith, that we continue that, because, Admiral Ferguson, as you mentioned, if we lose those people, if we lose those families, this country has a tough, tough road for us to travel down. And so I think you can tell from this subcommittee, we don't plan to go quietly in the night. We plan to fight as much as we can to make sure you guys never have a fair fight. We don't want you to have a fair fight. And we want to make sure the men and women who serve under you, who raise their hand, that we're keeping that faith with them, and that we are making sure they're the best trained, best prepared, best equipped military in the world. And thank you for your careers in helping to make that happen, and thank you for giving us a record that we can share with other members of Congress to help make that a reality. So thank you. With that, we're adjourned.